to ask you questions.
Perhaps, could I just clarify how much time you were expecting this session to be?
Basically, as long as you want, in the sense that this is the first time that we try to have a guest from a distant location. This kind of event is called the Teatime Research Circles, because usually what happens is that it's an informal event where a scholar comes, sends some articles or material before, and then gives a short presentation, and there is a lot of question and answers. But considering that you are far away, the presentation time, if you want, can be extended. I think that if we stay within, I don't know, an hour and a half, included the question times, but we said an hour, but it depends on you if you have and how many questions. So
I think what we can do is plan on an hour, because I know it's 5 o'clock in Toronto, so that's 6 o'clock. So I think if we work with an hour, then I think that's probably a reasonable length of time. And could I just ask, did you distribute any of my papers in advance? What can I expect people to know already?
Well, we sent the invitation to everybody, so there should be knowledge of, maybe, Amit, you can, you can maybe reply to this, because you had organized that more than me.
Hello, how are you?
Yep.
Thanks for accepting our invitation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you hear us?
I can hear you perfectly.
Yeah. Fortunately, we just we created a poster to circulate among our faculty and graduate students. And also I added those 2 articles so that you recommended for the audience before joining the event. Hope they have the time to go through it. Unfortunately, I myself, last term, I had the chance to go through your 2 or 3 of your papers. Yeah, and I hope, I'm sure, fortunately, most of the students, graduate students at OISE are quite familiar with your investment theory or identity theory. Yeah. So
the idea is usually that people read in advance what has been shared and then come and listen to the presentation, and then the questions are a bit on both aspects. That's the ideal scenario that we have in mind for this type of event.
Okay. So what I probably will do is I will move then fairly quickly, I won't rush, but I will move, in a sense, I will summarize some of the central ideas, and then I will open it up for questions. I can always come back and do a little bit more presentation, but this way I'll be able to engage a little bit more meaningfully with the group. How does that sound?
That's exactly the spirit of the entire thing. Yeah, that's
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So should I begin?
Okay. Just wanted to say, as Amit is the PhD student in the program, that is a graduate assistant helping me with the center. And as he said, I think that people came because they are very interested in your work, so they already know you. And we have a colleague. Come on, Toinette. We have different people. So Bonny Norton is a professor. I saw that you had your PhD here at the University of Toronto from your profile. Is that correct?
It's OISE U of T. That's exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So
Bonny was in our little neck of the woods.
Hi, Bonny.
It's Antoinette.
Yeah.
Yeah, and now she is a professor and distinguished university scholar at University of British Columbia in the Department of Language and Literacy Education. And as we saw, she is a very famous scholar in the area of identity, language learning, digital literacy, international development, as we have from her profile. And she has a lot of publications that I'm not gonna list here, and an amazing list of awards from your website. So your page at the university. She's also a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and the American Education Research Association, and recipient, among the others, from the TESOL Distinguished Research Award and the CSE Graduate Student Mentorship Award. So we are really excited and thrilled to have you here. And as I said, it's the first time that we try this solution with Zoom. Thanks to Antoinette, she convinced her also to do this kind of mixed form. And as I said, we try to record the presentation, so it should be also available later for you to on the website and other students or colleagues that couldn't participate. So thank you again, Bonny, and I leave you the floor without any other introduction. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, it's exciting to actually engage. I do believe in the digital as a way of collapsing time and space. So it's wonderful to do this. I know that for some people it's a little experimental. I was very happy to hear you were using Zoom, because I do think Zoom is one of the best around. And so I'm so happy to be able to use this particular format. So, you know, and of course, it's wonderful to kind of connect with Oise, of course, which is my alma mater, and had a number of very happy years at Oise. Is, you know, I'm going to talk a bit about identity, investment, and digital storytelling. And as you can see, the image that I've chosen on my screen represents the hopes of many people in different parts of the world who want to enter the digital world but don't yet have the resources. That's the bottom image is a picture taken in northwestern Uganda by Willie Ngaka, and it's a clay keyboard, and people in Uganda are saying they'd like to enter the digital world, and they'll be ready. They're getting ready with the use of a clay keyboard. I do have a website, and I have lots of information on the website. So what we can't cover in this talk and in our discussion, please feel free. You just Google Bonny Norton with a Y, and you should get to my website, and there's certainly lots of information available. I'm going to talk a little bit about my foundational work on identity, investment, and imagined communities, and some of my more recent work with Ron Darwin on an enhanced model of investment. Then I'd like to share with you some of the digital storytelling that we've been doing, because the digital storytelling, which is free and open access, means that these stories can be shared in many parts of the world. And because they are bilingual and multilingual, it has the possibility of promoting language and literacy learning. So I'm very excited by that work. Of course, I'm still always interested in how we examine the relationship between the language learner and the social world, the conditions under which social interaction takes place, how relations of power impact those relationships, racism, sexism, elitism, and homophobia. Those questions still remain relevant today. And I have to say, I can't help just noting right now, sorry that I'm kind of going off track, but I think that's Antoinette that I see. Sorry, I have to just mention this because This is what the digital does. And I'm just going to say hello to Antoinette, because of course Antoinette and I go back many years and we stay very connected in multiple ways. So I just have to say hello.
Well, hello, Bonnie. Sorry, I was just trying to mute some of the people coming in remotely because we can hear some funny clattering. So if all of those of you who are joining us remotely can make sure that your microphones are muted so we don't hear the background noise, that would be great. Thank you.
I mean, this is all a journey of discovery as well, you know, in a sense, just seeing how we can learn together about the digital. And if you think, again, that the digital is also a very inclusive, could be a very inclusive way to bring people together. You I think are familiar with my work, some of you who talk about learners of English who talk about their sense of inferiority when they speak with mother tongue speakers, especially when they come, for example, as immigrants into Canada, and they say, you know, I feel inferior because English is their mother tongue and they speak fluently without any problems. So that whole question of the relationship between the native speaker and non-native speaker is one that is still very prevalent in our field. And I've said that every time language learners speak, they're not only exchanging information with their interlocutors, they are organizing and reorganizing a sense of who they are and how they relate to the social world. And this is what I mean by identity construction and negotiation. You know, I do a lot of work in the African context, and just to share with you, we in the field, we talk about language as a linguistic system and language as a social practice. And just as an example of that is a case of one of a family that came and spent a year here in Vancouver and went back to Uganda. They reflected on their experiences in Canada as they moved across the border. Are people connecting okay?
Yeah, mute, Cecilia.
I hope some of you are simply reading this while we're sorting out the technical difficulties. Can I continue?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so the point simply being that language is not only a linguistic system, but also a social practice. When you learn, as you learn, not only what to speak, but when to speak, how to navigate social relationships. Since this is something that you can see later, I will move on. And what, in terms of notions of identity, what we're looking at is how a person understands his or her relationship to the world, and how that relationship is structured across time and space, and how a person understands possibilities for the future. So the notion of the future is something that has also been very central in my work. And you'll see that I've spoken about one's imagined identities and the imagined communities that one wishes to be part of. So for me, it's not only about learning the rules of use. Hymes talks about the rules of use. It's also about the right to speech and the power to impose reception. So one might have the capacity to speak, but the issue becomes, are people listening? Do people value the speaker? So that notion of power is one that is very central in my work. And some of you might be familiar with the work of my research on Mai, who I've argued was highly motivated but not invested in the language practices of her classroom. She removed herself from a classroom because, in a sense, the teacher was spending a lot of time talking about their past, talking about life in their home countries, rather than really addressing issues of the future, which for many immigrants are central. So what I've done is to draw a distinction between motivation and investment, because motivation is a psychological construct. It assumes that people have unitary identities and that motivation is a character trait of an individual. But the construct of investment signals learners as social beings, as having complex identities which change across time and space and are reproduced in social interaction. So what we see here is the centrality of power in human relationships. I've argued that if learners invest in a second language, they will acquire a wider range of symbolic and material resources, which will increase their cultural capital and social power. And by symbolic resources, I refer to language, education, and friendship, and material resources, capital, real estate, money. A lot of this is inspired by the work of Bourdieu, but Bourdieu doesn't talk about investment in these terms, but the ideas are, in a sense, inspired by his work on cultural and symbolic and social capital. When you think about what Mai's imagined community was, so Mai was somebody who worked in a factory, and she said, after work today, when I was walking by myself on New Street, I met Carl, who was going to the same school with me last course. I just talked to him about my job and the course I was taking, and he said, the good thing for you is to go to school, then in the future you'd have the job to work in the office. I hope so, but I'm scared to dream. So what we see here is, again, what are people's imagined communities and imagined identities, and how does their investment in those communities impact their relationship to classrooms? And that, for me, is a fascinating question. So Mai, who is a highly motivated learner, is not invested in the language practices of a classroom if it doesn't value, in a sense, her hopes for the future and her investments in certain language practices. So my question is, not only are students motivated to learn a language, or are teachers motivated to teach? The question is, are students and teachers invested in the language and literacy practices of a given classroom? That, for me, becomes a central question. And at the same time, issues of student and teacher identity are central. So I have a small little study. One of my students, this is in my study, I wrote about it in a little article that I published in Gary Barkhuizen's book in 2017. One of my students was in class and she said, Bonnie, I'm very excited about notions of investment. I'm going to try it out. And she said, many adult learners that I work with drop out of class. And she said, for example, last semester, there were 25 students in my class and 9 remained at the end. And after we had discussed investment and, obviously spent a good deal of time in a course on identity investment and language learning, she came back and she said it was quite remarkable because in her new class that she was teaching, there were 29 students in the class at the beginning and 25 remained. So I said to her, what have you done? What did you do to promote investment? And she said, I began by imagining what a good English teacher would look like for my students. I altered my practice to reflect what I imagined their idea of a good school would look like. So in a sense, what she was saying is that by shifting in many ways her identity and the language practices of her classroom, students invested in the classroom and therefore remained till the end. I'm not going to go into too many details, but we can certainly talk about this in the Q&A as to what might it mean to promote student investment in the language practices of a classroom. Now, one of the papers I think I gave you to read or recommended you read was the paper that I published with Ron Darwin, a PhD student of mine who's just about to finish. He's doing his defense next week. Or is it? No, 2 weeks' time. And it really looks at the new economic world order and evolving theories of language ideologies, linguistic capital, and symbolic competence in a world where technology is changing the way in which we relate to one another. And so when we talk about mobility, it's not just physical mobility, moving from one place to another, but it's also virtual mobility, very much as we are now connecting with you in Toronto and me in Vancouver. The digital world is changing the way we relate to one another. So in this paper, which was published in the Annual Review of Applied Linguistics, we expanded the model of investment that I had developed in the late 90s and 2000s. What we're looking here at a new social world, new forms of social interaction, and new ways of conceptualizing speech. How do we claim the right to speak in the digital era? So I'm going to take you back to the African context, since we lost track a little bit earlier. Here we have an example of Henrietta, who is a woman, a young woman in Uganda. And many young women in Uganda, especially in the rural areas, do not have very much power in their communities. A lot of them have very many domestic chores, which keep them busy for a great deal of the day. But if you put a computer in one of their hands, you are changing her relationship to the world. And she can go into a police commissioner's office, as you see in the bottom picture, and take a picture and take a video, because she now becomes a person with power. If she doesn't have the power, she knows people who have power. So we're talking here about the networks of power within which people live. So she gets taken seriously. She begins to be seen as a legitimate speaker because she is a person who has power. And you see in the final picture, these young women are all in an internet cafe in a smaller town in Uganda. And that gives them, it shifts their identity and their relationship to the world. So as people engage with the digital world and have access to new kinds of resources, they shift their relations of power in their communities. Even this is also, of course, for teachers. So Betty, for example, it was a Ugandan school teacher, says, I feel very powerful like a man because I'd never held a camera in my life. I have always seen only men carrying cameras and taking photos in big public functions, like maybe independence celebrations, political rallies, and wedding ceremonies. But now as I move in the community taking pictures with my camera, I feel like I'm also very powerful, like a man. I'm now a learned person. So what this captures in many ways is precisely a shift of identity. And even though Betty herself was already a learned person before she picked up a camera, because she knew how to survive in her society, she became a teacher, she navigated a great number of challenges. But it's only when she picks up a camera and can take pictures and is seen to be more powerful that she sees herself as a learned person. It's a very, very interesting shift of identity. So when we think then of the expanded model of investment, what we're looking at is clearly the relationship between identity and investment, but also an expanded notion of capital as well as ideology. So the forms of capital that we're looking at is economic capital, which I think you would be familiar with, wealth, property, and income. There's also the cultural capital, the knowledge that you have, the educational credentials that you have, the cultural forms that you are familiar with. This also gives you power. And certainly the connections or social capital, which is your connections to networks of power, are also significant. Much the same way with Betty, who has a camera, or Henrietta, who has a camera. These cameras assume that you are part of networks of power where there are financial and cultural resources that shift your relationship to your community. And if you think about issues of ideology, which we define as dominant ways of thinking that organize and stabilize society while simultaneously determining modes of inclusion and exclusion. Who is a legitimate person in a given society? If we think, for example, of the shifts of identity in the US, which is grappling with a very different world situation than it was 2 years ago. What does it mean to be Mexican, for example? Who determines modes of inclusion and exclusion? And this is also very much the case in Canada, in different ways and in different parts of the world. What does it mean to be Indigenous in Canada? Is it a valued identity? Who determines modes of inclusion and exclusion? So what I've done with my work then is, when I think about the work that I do as an educator, although I'm fascinated by ideas, I'm interested and excited by new ways of conceptualizing the world, issues of identity, I'm also very concerned about resources. Who has access to resources, and what can we as teachers do to ensure that people not only locally but globally have resources that might be helpful to them. And I'm going to take you out of this PowerPoint and take you to a project that I've been working on. I hope you can see it. I'm assuming you can see it. Actually, Hamid, can you just put your finger up, your thumbs up, and tell me you can see it? Okay. So what we're doing with our Storybooks project is to make free open access stories available to children, youth and families, not only in Canada, but also in every region of the world. I mean, we are ambitious, but the digital allows us to actually move across time and space. So we are developing portals that can be customized for language and literacy stories in every region of the world. I'm going to explain to you how this happens, and I hope that you will also get excited by the power of stories, and in particular, the bilingual and multilingual possibilities. I'm going to pull up Storybooks Canada, because what we've done with Storybooks Canada, which is we've been experimenting with this platform and doing a lot of development around Storybooks Canada, not only in terms of material that we put on the website, but also the software itself that can be repurposed for other in other domains. So as you see, I've been very active in the African context, for many years, and I am a research advisor of a project called the African Storybook, which makes stories available free and open access to children and families across the African continent. And there are over 1,000 stories, over 150 languages, and about over 5,000 translations. And what we've done with Storybooks Canada is to repurpose those stories for the Canadian context. And I'm going to show you here. I'm going to just see, what you see here is that we have translated 40 stories from the African Storybook into the dominant languages spoken in Canada. And we've done this in both print and audio version. So we've got English, French, Arabic, Bengali, Cantonese, German, Italian, Korean, Mandarin, Persian, Polish, Portuguese, Punjabi, Somali, Spanish, Tagalog, Turkish, and Urdu. And we've got others that we are busy working on. But these also then are available in audio form. And you toggle. I'm going to give an example of this. I'm going to take you. I hope you're going to be able to read this. So I hope that the audio is going to come through. Let's have a look. So we can just look at. I like to read now. The image here, I'm going to see if I can move it. Yes, I can move it. Because I can, this is getting in the way of my, there we go. Oh, perfect. I can see you at the bottom. So I'm going to take this up here. And first of all, we're going to see here. Let's see, I hope the audio works here. I'm just going to put this up here. Right.
I like to read.
Can you hear that?
Perfect, yeah.
Great. So you've got the English version. Now you can turn that. You know, if you want to, if you're doing French immersion, for example, and you want it in French, at least to see the translation in French, you have the translation that's available, and you can toggle between English and French, but you can toggle, of course, between many other languages as well. So I'm going to ask Hamid, if I can hear you, Hamid, which of these languages would you like me to experiment with?
Persian.
Persian. Okay. That's a good example, because what we see there is also a script, and part of what the logic of this project is also to introduce children to multiple, not only of course Iranian kids or Persian speaking kids, to their language, but also to ensure that children from many other parts of the world who are in our classrooms in Canada can become more aware of what other languages sound like, what their print systems are, and you develop, and as you begin to understand the complexity of language, our hope is that people develop new relationships with speakers. So let's have a look at what we can do here is I'm going to show you, I'm going to do an autoplay. And so that will take you automatically through the story. Let's hope that works.
من به خواندن علاقه دارم. من به خواندن علاقه دارم. من برای چه کسی می توانم بخوانم؟ خواهرم خوابیده است.
Okay, I'm going to stop there. I think you can get a sense of it. You may not know, unless you speak Persian, what has been said. But I'm going to show you the English. My sister is asleep. I'm going to show you the French. Okay. So I think what you can see here is a very powerful tool that can be used in multiple ways in very different kinds of classrooms. And I'd like you to take you to the resources that we have. Well, first of all, maybe what I need to do is I'm going to take you back to the English and show you we've got many download options, because if people don't have, computers and teachers don't have the internet, you can download these stories in many different formats. And in the classes, you can also, for example, have imageless PDFs. Kids can draw their own images. They can also, you can print it in landscape form. For example, there we go, where you'd have a text that has both the English and the French together. So that's, again, the power of the bilingual text. And we've got, I'm going to just close that down. And we've got other kinds of resources for teachers. And in the British Columbia context, we are aligning the Storybooks Canada with the BC curriculum and showing how, in fact, the stories link very much with curricular competencies. The name of the story, the theme, for example, in K through 12, K through 3, they're looking at families and animals and feelings and so forth. And these link to language arts and math and physical and health education. So we try to make these very user-friendly for teachers. You know, we've got different levels of stories, so that are all of different length. And also we have what are called high-low stories, because when immigrants and refugees come to Canada, their vocabulary might be quite low, but they don't want to read children's books. They want to read books that are appropriate for their age group, for example, and their interests. So that is what we call high-low texts. So a person who's, for example, 16 to 14 years of age might be interested in hair, but can only read 1 or 2 short, simple sentences per page. So we are developing teacher resources, and we're working with school systems. I'm going to just go back to, because I know many points I want to mention, but in Canada, we are also very concerned about Indigenous indigeneity and promoting Indigenous education and Indigenous languages. So we have worked on Indigenous storybooks, and the project lead of this is a Haida scholar called Dr. Sarah Davidson. She's a UBC alumna. And what we're doing in very similar kind of concept, which is using the software that we've developed for Storybooks Canada, we are making Indigenous stories available in multiple languages. So I can show you, for example, we are working with Cree at the moment, and Old Masset, English, French, and Spanish. And we're working obviously with English and French because these are Canada's official languages. But we also have a research program with Mexico. And so when people are translating these Indigenous stories into Mexican Indigenous languages, they need Spanish, because Spanish is a common language in that context. So I think maybe what I'm going to do is just to share with you Old Masset, which is a Haida language, and you can see, how the system works for Haida and Indigenous languages as well. I'm going to pull that up, and just to note everybody that because these stories are all free and open access, people also, we use Creative Commons licenses, so people do get acknowledged for what they do, whether they wrote the story or illustrated the story or translated the story. There is acknowledgement for what they have done. And we have students, for example, who have done our translations and have gone back to Saudi Arabia, for example, and have been able to demonstrate to their communities what service they have done and also what contributions they have made. So I'll just share with you, I won't go too far, but let's have a look at this Masset, the Haida Old Masset. So what we see here is Little Bear gives thanks, and of course, Petit Ours dit merci. So I think this gives you a sense of what we're trying to do. Perhaps I'm going to just close this down, and let's have a look. Maybe I can just stop share. Maybe I'll stop share. How's that? That probably is a good idea. Okay, great. Oh my goodness, there's a whole bunch of people. You weren't on Bloor Street. They didn't come and round you up to tell you to come in. So good to see. The last time I looked, the place was completely empty.
They came just after because the door unfortunately had locked itself. So it was a question of a minute, and then they came and you started sharing your screen, and so you didn't see.
Okay, good. Well, what a delight. What a delight to see you all. And now I can see Antoinette as well, which is really wonderful. So I know we were a little interrupted at the beginning, but I hope you've got a bit of a sense, right, of some of the theoretical work that I'm doing, but also trying to kind of link it to social practice through open access resources, which also raise many important questions about research, questions around translation, around ownership, around identity, around pedagogy. And you'll see from my recent publications that we are grappling with these issues. So even if we are, we've got these resources, which are wonderful, I think, but it does raise many questions around who uses them, how are they used, how do you translate, how do you use open access and still acknowledge the work that people have done. How do teachers' identities shift as they engage with technology, as we've done, for example, in the Ugandan context? So certainly issues of they do raise many important questions for research purposes. And the team of students that work with me got a very active team, very wonderful team. And I do want to acknowledge in particular Liam Doherty, who's our technical genius on the team, and also Espen Stranger Johansen, who was one of my PhD students. In fact, he's now a professor in Norway. And Liam is in fact one of Patsy Duff's amazing students. So we kind of work together because we do believe in open access and the possibility of sharing through the digital, which is exactly what we're doing right now, because I'm sitting in Vancouver and you're sitting in Toronto, but we have the capacity to share ideas and to work together collaboratively for new horizons. So I'm going to just say thank you very much, everybody. I'm hoping that this does open up some questions and we can continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. I think that it's really inspiring. We will share also maybe some of our experiences on top of questions, and I think it's really a trailblazing idea, and I'm very happy that you shared it with us. And well, I open the floor to questions and comments and intervention on your side. Yeah, please go ahead.
So Bonnie, can you see me in the big screen? Okay. So thank you very much for sharing that. That was wonderful. For me, the part that rings true in my teaching capacity right now is that I'm an ESL teacher, and sometimes I find my own students voicing what you found, that as L2 speakers of English, there's an inferiority complex for them. They just don't feel part of the social culture milieu of the country in which they're learning English. And so my question is, when you're looking or listening to their stories, is there a way that maybe the digital things that you've kind of got experience with there can tap into capturing in more a narrative inquiry-based style their story, instead of kind of going wide, you're going deep with their stories and trying to pull out from them their concerns, their tensions, and try to capture that, so that then retelling it maybe helps them to put them in a position of, well, that's what they think they are, but this is how they may be seen elsewhere.
Okay, thank you. I think there are two answers to, well, there are probably many answers to the question, but I'm going to step back just a second and look at what we think the power of these digital stories are for classroom interaction. Because when people just let's look at the case of Persian. A little Persian kid, a little Iranian kid comes into class, and they're native speakers in the class, and she doesn't feel that comfortable, and she feels, she can speak Persian, but who cares? But when suddenly you see a story that's available in Persian, in this very interesting script, and she sees her language valued in the classroom, what we find is that it shifts relations of power in the classroom. And in fact, interestingly, Antoinette, one of the students that Antoinette supervised at OISE is now working with me at UBC. Her name is Monica Shank. She worked with stories in the Tanzanian context. And what she found is that speakers of Ma, which is like a minority language in Tanzania, always felt uncomfortable in class, especially relative to the Swahili speakers. But once they saw that their language was valued and they saw it in print and they saw stories available, the Swahili speakers suddenly got very interested in Ma and started looking very differently at those Ma speakers. And they became very interested. Well, so what is this language? And suddenly what you're doing is you're shifting and relations of power in the classroom. So that's just one facet of shifting, how we need to shift those relations. When it comes to telling your own story, of course, through digital storytelling, you can, of course, tell your own story. The question becomes, of course, who is listening, right? Now, that is interesting, right? You can tell your story, and you can do it through the digital, and you can share it. I know, for example, Shirk has a wonderful digital storytelling competition every year, and one of my students, Ron Darwin, in fact, he was up in the top 25 and did very well in that, and he was telling the story of his research. You still are going to grapple with the challenge of, are people listening? And that, I think even telling your story, I think already helps. That of course you have the opportunity to tell your story. The question becomes kind of for teachers is how can you ensure that story is valued by others, right? By a multilingual community. And what we found through our own digital storytelling project, our storybooks, is that because we've got the same story that's available in multiple languages, people can see the story, in Ma or in Persian or Cantonese or in Italian, but then they can see it in English. So in a sense, and you can see it in French. So it's that collaborative kind of learning, that collaborative sharing of understanding that is very powerful. And people are listening to one another's story, even if they don't understand the language, they know that they can enter into it, through their own language. So the power of the digital in enabling one story to have many different formats is actually very empowering. And I think, and as I say, as we saw with Monica, we've seen in classrooms that this generates a great deal of interest, and then children can also go and write their own stories, of course. But they've already renegotiated the relations of power in their classrooms, and that is pedagogically something that teachers can help make happen.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay.
Helpful.
Any other comments, questions?
I was going to ask, can you hear me?
I can, but I can't see you.
No, I don't know why, but the camera went. Anyway, it was on earlier before you came on screen. Hello, Bonnie. My name is Miriam, and I'm at OISE for my first year. I would like to just know if you have some samples of the children's work that they've done when they've integrated the book into making their own stories, and then any of the literacy measurements that may have already taken place with regular English as a second language programs, French immersion programs, Indigenous populations.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, the interesting thing is you're going to have to invite me to Oise next year because I'm busy. I'm busy. Well, I'll do it virtually. I can do it.
Yeah.
That's exactly what we're doing right now. I'm doing a project with Rahat Zaidi, who actually has done. She certainly has done a lot of work with Jim Cummins, or certainly drawing on Jim Cummins' work, where we actually are looking at how teachers are using these stories for French immersion purposes. So we will have more insight about that, about that particular research project. And we also are, we're working at the moment, we're just going through some ethics review for working with parents and children in the Vancouver context. My student Monica Shank, Michelle Gilman is doing her research on that. And then I've got Asma Afreen, who's doing her research with community-based organizations. So this is exactly what is ongoing as we speak. I do have the research that I did with Espen Stranger Johansson that was published in the Modern Language Journal. There we looked at shifts of teacher identity as students engage with the stories. So you can, I think that might have been one of the articles that I recommended that you read, but I'm not sure. But that was just published in 2017. So you can certainly review how teachers and students were working with those stories. In terms of measurement, that will probably be the next stage as we actually now we've done this development, we are doing the research, in the context of classrooms and communities, and then would be able to move on to look at outcomes. We know for certain, and this is, for example, through the work of Monica Shank, that children are developing their own stories. She's got wonderful examples of it, and she has shared those with us. And I'm sure, I'll have to say, watch that space. Thank you, Miriam.
Thank you, Bonnie. Yes, Way from Kamloops. Way. Yeah, that's a Shwimek greeting.
Oh, thank you.
Bonnie, I have a question concerning the Indigenous stories. What I like is that even in those stories, you have the Indigenous language and then you have the English and French. Yes. My question is, how did you construct them? I mean, what was the work beforehand with the Indigenous educators and students, and how did they accept to translate? I'm telling you because I have a project myself where we try to I believe a lot in the fact that we need to be together and not on two different continents, as sometimes it happens with Indigenous educators, because it's like it's inappropriate if we do something, if we reach out and they don't reach back to non-Indigenous. So I'm very curious of how you solved this riddle, and what is if you have any, even without any data, but really what was the experience in doing that and using?
Well, I can tell you, remember I said to you that one of the research questions is issues of ownership. And that is absolutely a question that we are grappling with Indigenous communities. So in terms of the stories that we are using for translation purposes, those were all stories that were written there was an organization called Little Cree Books, and they were written for the purpose of open access. And so we don't have any problems there in terms of translation. What we've done with other communities who are unfamiliar with the notion of open access and are still learning about the possibilities, you'll have to go to the website and you'll see we've got a tab called resources. And when you pull down that tab, you'll see many, many, many resources that are available in multiple Indigenous languages. Now, those are freely available, but they're not available for translation.
Oh, I see. Yeah,
So that's how we navigate. There's stories that are available for translation, and there are stories that are available for use, but not for translation. And that's how we, you know, it's a journey. You know, it's
not easy.
It's not easy, but it's exciting, and there are huge possibilities. But we do acknowledge that we have to go, we have to proceed respectfully. And if you want to navigate that site, we've got lots of information on how we've proceeded. We've got lots of information on the resources. We've got a Q&A section, and you will see how we have proceeded. We would love to see more translations, for example. We've got the translation project with Mexico, but we're also working with other communities in the British Columbia context. And so you will see more translations as we develop our networks. But that all does take time, because people need to see the value, in a sense, of having the work available open access. And that's part of the conversation. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
And if, who said?
That sounds like Catherine.
Yeah, Amy, yeah, please.
My concern with looking at your books was, and I know you already spoke about culture, and you have kind of a high esteem of culture as a powerful vehicle, but my concern with the book was I'm more interested in counterculture, which is the idea that some artists want to present themselves as non-powerful, you know, that kind of attitude. Your books, to me, were a little, you're probably aware of this, but the Hollywood aspect where the bear is wearing a t-shirt, were you sensitive to that at all? That's.
You mean with the Indigenous story? Sorry.
Yeah, it was the little bear book.
The little bear?
Yeah, he's wearing a red t-shirt climbing up the tree.
Yeah, and
that's a Hollywood thing to me.
Okay. Now, interestingly enough, because the project lead, you know, on this project is Sarah Davidson, what she did when she went through the original set of stories that were available, she eliminated some. Because she actually felt that, I just remember there was one, and I'll give an example of that. It actually had images of, you know, toilet rolls, right? Mm-hmm. So there was cardboard was being used. These toilet roll cardboard was being used for, I don't know what, to make some objects. I can't remember what it was. Yeah. And she said this is not something that she was concerned that this was not a respectful use of a story. So interesting.
Yeah, we all have different opinions that way. So it's funny because whereas someone would say the t-shirt's fine, people would say it isn't.
Exactly. But see, the thing is that's why you would have the choice. You would say, I don't like this one. I don't feel comfortable with this story. So that is not one that I'm going to translate, you know? Mm-hmm. So when one pulls up, you might be working with the
illustrations.
With another Indigenous language, and you would say this is not a story that I feel comfortable translating, and so it would therefore not. You would have the choice to say it will not be available in my language. So I mean that's the whole point. That's quite interesting about open access, is that you know there is a lot of decision making. You can choose what you want, what you don't want, and there are, of course, multiple different opinions about what is acceptable and not acceptable.
I mean, not only the textual level, but the illustrations.
Absolutely, the illustrations, absolutely, very, very important. And I mean, one forgets sometimes and thinks, text is about print, but of course the illustrations are hugely important as well. Yeah.
What I just wanted to point out, Amy, is that this particular book with the bear and the t-shirt has been sourced from the Little Cree book.
That's right, yes.
Right, so it was actually an originally created manuscript with illustrations that the Cree community felt was obviously appropriate. So
I realize that, Antoinette. I'm just saying, even within the Cree community, visual artists have very different opinions.
Of course.
So you might have an art, and same with these binoculars made out of toilet paper rolls. To me, that is not just respectful, but people might find that, oh, well, that's sort of playing with junk. So, you know, to me, I think it's resourceful. So
yeah, I mean, this is what is so interesting is that, I mean, if somebody was listening, they would be writing a paper about this.
I realize, and what I'm trying to think is that I think it really matters.
But that's exactly what is so interesting about this work, is that it raises precisely those kinds of questions. What do people find acceptable? Not what? Who does? Who decides? These are the questions that we have to grapple with, you know, on a regular basis. And it does raise really important questions for, you know, what gets taught in schools and how it gets taught and who takes it up. And you know, the one thing that that I always try to feel, though, is that in the end, not in the end, in the beginning, the middle, and the end, we need resources for children, right? So, you know, how can we respectfully work with communities and ensure that stories are available to children and families, and not only respectfully, but listen in a sense to advice and encourage people to, of course, write their own stories, and possibly even share those stories as well. So yeah, it's very exciting. Thank you. Any other questions?
Other question? I don't want to take too much space from the students. If you have other questions, please go ahead. Okay. Otherwise, I do have another. I have slides. I have like thousands of questions.
you're not actually on the camera.
I don't know. No, you don't see me now.
I do, and now I do. Yes.
Good. Oh, okay. Yeah, I was curious to see if, okay, you already said and wrote that they feel more empowered, that they feel because there is their language. Now, my curiosity is, do you have any results that show the kids to feel free to have a less monolingual attitude, in the sense of having some plurilingual practices, like mixing some languages, or using one word of the other language, included not just their own, but the languages of the class in some form of speech or writing or any production that they would have done. Like, it's only changing the power, the vision and the feeling, or it's also changing the attitudes toward the language, in not seeing them compartmentalized in siluses.
Yeah, I guess what you're asking is in a sense the role of translanguaging, right? If I understand, you know, plurilingualism and, you know, how one navigates that. And certainly in Uganda, where we were doing some of our earlier work, what we saw is that kids, you know, engaged very actively with the text and were certainly a lot more lively and were more comfortable in talking, and in that particular case, drawing on not only English but also, of course, the local languages. It's still, you know, it so much does depend a little bit on the context, because what we also found is that in a place like Uganda, English is still, you know, considered, you know, the official language. And if teachers don't use English or standard English, teachers themselves feel as if they might be positioned as less than competent. Parents also expect, you know, teachers to promote standard English. And the teachers themselves feel uncomfortable if they're not using standard English in the classroom. So it's complex. I mean, we certainly do deal with this, and sometimes I make the distinction between written text and spoken text, because I think with spoken text, one can experiment with language in multiple kinds of ways. When it comes to written text, people are a little bit more conservative. I think people feel that the goal is, in fact, for example, standard English, or a standard form of language. They're much more comfortable with orally experimenting with plurilingual practices. But when it comes to writing, that becomes a lot more complex. So I don't know if you have experience in this regard, because that seems to be what our findings suggest.
So they do not necessarily mix pieces of their story. Have they ever been asked to create a common story among kids who speak different languages, for example?
Not necessarily. Only sometimes if they struggling for a word, what I mean, they might just import a word because
which is already a good translanguage.
Exactly.
But my question was, do they acquire this kind of plurilingual attitude where they feel free to see things from different?
It's a very interesting question, and I'd love you to go and do some research. And when you've got your findings, please let me know.
Yeah, you said we can use your material. I mean, that's available.
And all I ask is to publish it in an open access journal, and then I'll put it up on our website.
Yeah, exactly.
So this is the thing. It would be amazing to see, if what impact that might have in terms of the production of plurilingual texts.
Yeah, because we still have this monolingual view,
absolutely.
Them these beautiful products, but one next to the other.
Yes, exactly.
And I wonder if they dare breaking the barrier.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I think you also would have to work with parents as well. I'm not quite sure exactly how and what age, but you'd have to kind of figure out how to bring parents on board, because that's one of the things that we've also struggled with, is that, obviously parents want to see their children succeed, and examinations, the TOEFL test, for example, is not plurilingual. IELTS tests are not plurilingual. So when these gatekeeping mechanisms are in one language, it becomes more complex in terms of getting buy-in from parents and administrators. You can see it as a journey, of course, but whether you will see it as an integral part of a curriculum, I think, is always one of those very complicated questions.
There start to be some high-stake tests. For example, in Greece and in Austria, there are now 2 types of high-stake tests taken at the end of the secondary school that mix languages. Like the students are given material in Greek, for example, or in German, and they have to not to translate, but to use different materials to come up in English with some form of explanation and bullet point, etc., to produce totally different text starting from that. So there is some hope, but they are not tested in the sense of TOEFL, etc. They are exams, high stakes exam at the end of a cycle of school.
That's fascinating. Yeah, thank you. I think I saw another hand.
Yeah. Yeah, Amy, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Just along those lines, looking at the framework, and you're looking at the European framework where they're teaching all the different languages. They show idioms in languages. So like putting all your eggs in one basket. So I was thinking, if you had a plurilingual text, you could have, because children look at all the illustrations and they're aware of all little things and details. You could have a little mouse in the corner, putting all his eggs in one basket. And the storyline is saying that she's really relying on this one thing. But the little tiny picture, some little child will say, oh yeah, he's putting all his eggs in one basket in the French, for a French story, but it's an English idiom.
Exactly. Well, you know what, I would love you. I hope that you will be encouraged to go and have a look on our website. We've got a wonderful YouTube video by Asma Afreen, who describes how she translated a story from English into Bengali. It's absolutely fascinating. And she developed almost a kind of theoretical frame of how she went about doing it. And she actually won our local, when she did her master's degree, and we have a prize for the best master's paper, kind of graduating paper, which she won in our department. So that was wonderful. And then she's now moved into the PhD, and she's going to be publishing that. So do have a look at it. It's now available. And, you know, I think you'd love how she navigated, you know, the whole process of translation.
Perfect, 'cause I'm doing Bengali.
Great.
Good. So, any other questions or comments about communication, and then for our guest?
Can you hear me still? It's
Yes.
Miriam again.
Oh, okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Maria.
Hi. I was just going to ask again about mainly the Indigenous, and also a whole series of Ukrainian stories that I know of are oral stories. They're originally from oral tradition, and like most of our traditional fairy tales. So you cannot, you don't need author's permission, but because there's also, you have to access the culture and the language and have permission to bring their stories into print and translate. What are the effects of having the languages and the culture interpreted in a different way? When I read somebody else's story in their language, I have my own interpretation and my own perspective, and I'm not going to be able to access it through the author's perspective. So what do you talk about then for interpreting and interpretation?
Okay, and this I'll probably end on this question because it takes me all the way back to Oisy and the amazing PhD I did, because Oisy introduced me to the work of Derrida. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the work of Derrida, but what Derrida says, he's a French philosopher, every reading is a rereading. Yeah. And for me, that is very empowering, because you're absolutely right, Miriam. You know, every story, you know, has a meaning that is different for not only every writer, but every reader. And in fact, one of the papers that I wrote, actually it was published in the Harvard Educational Review in 1995, which is how long ago was that? 95, 2005, 2015, more than 20 years ago, was precisely on this very issue. That, of course, a text has multiple meanings, but the same text can shift its meaning depending on how it gets taken up in a given context. And I wrote about this, please don't check it out, everybody. I'd love your kind of perspective on it, because I think it still holds true. The story, the research was about a test. I know you were talking about measurement, that was being tried out in a classroom in South Africa. And in one context, it was a test genre, right? So kids had to determine what was the right answer, and they had to go through, and they had multiple choice, and they'd say yes, no, correct, not correct. Then the whole situation changed, and the teacher, this was Pippa Stein at the time, started having a discussion about what that text meant. So in the context of the text, the test, the meaning of the text was singular. It was about monkeys that stole fruit from a garden in Durban. When it got rediscussed by the same people, but in a different genre, where in fact there was discussion and debate, there were no one right answers, the whole meaning of that text shifted. And the argument that we made in that particular paper was that meaning is volatile, and it shifts, not only for different readers, but for the very same readers who read in a different genre, so to speak. And I think that this applies absolutely to these texts that might be written by one group and then read by another group, maybe even read by the author 5 years later and have a very different kind of meaning. So, I mean, Derrida talked about, you know, the multiplicity of meaning and the complexity of, because meaning is constructed not only by the writer, but also by the reader. And that is what is kind of very exciting about theory, because it helps us to understand why we need to see text as situated and meaning as multiple. And of course, as you know, you shift the genre, you're also shifting the identities. So whereas in the case of the test, where one person was a test taker, that was the identity, when the genre shifted, that person was no longer a test taker, but in fact, you know, had a very different kind of identity and read the text in a very different way. I remember reading a paper by Chinua Achebe. It was about Chinua Achebe's, no, I think it was Chinua Achebe's reading of Heart of Darkness. And it was a paper that I read in Roger Simon, who was my supervisor actually at OISE, brilliant scholar. And it was how Chinua Achebe, read Heart of Darkness. And it was liberating and fascinating, because you see how people read things differently depending on, you know, in a sense, their identity, and also, I would add, their investment in the text itself. So I think I'm going to end right on that note, everybody, and wish you all a wonderful evening and wonderful weekend. And I'm going to catch a little bit of the sun left here in Vancouver.
Yeah, which is a perfect note for co-constructing meaning also of your wonderful talk. So thank you again for being with us, for sharing all that, and I'm sure we hope we will have you next year again.
Okay, thank you, everybody. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.